Hello and welcome to the first episode of A Critical Ear broadcasting on Flirt FM 101.3 in the Galway region and online. My name is Andrew Boyle and I'll be with you for the next hour or so. In this show we'll be looking at prospects for diplomacy and for international relations as Joe Biden looks to take over as President of the United States from mid-January. We'll be looking at microbial resistance, what it is and why it might be at the centre of the next pandemic, and we'll be exploring the Galway Science and Engineering Festival, which took place recently here in Galway. So stay tuned. In Poland, the Times Higher Education, or DHE, reports that higher education and the government are on a collision course after the new Education and Science Minister threatened to withdraw funding from institutions that cancelled classes on a recent day of protests against a court ruling that would outlaw almost all abortions. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports that so far in 2020, 23 journalists have been killed worldwide. The greatest number of deaths was in Mexico, where 5 journalists were killed, 4 of them murdered. And the International Trade Union Confederation, or ITUC, is pressing for urgent and large-scale investment in rapid antigen testing for the virus that causes COVID-19 in order to bring the pandemic under control. Sharon Burrow, ITUC General Secretary, said, adding these tests to the existing armoury of measures to tackle the pandemic would enable workplaces that have been shut down to reopen safely with a very high degree of confidence. According to Ms. Burrow, masks, social distancing, sick pay for everyone who tests positive, social protection and job and business support measures are still essential and are vital to the effective rollout of rapid antigen or strip tests, but those tests can make a real contribution to stopping the virus and saving jobs. While we're all very much focused on COVID-19 and the current pandemic, researchers are concerned about what might be the cause of the pandemic that we next see.
This is Ana Carmo with UN News. All around the world, people, plants and animals are dying from infections that cannot be treated, even with the best medicines available. That is because of the rise in antimicrobial resistance, the increasing failure of antibiotics and other life-saving drugs to treat diseases. It is a global problem that threatens to be the cause of the next pandemic, as the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, Chief Veterinary Officer Keith Sumption explains to FAO's Charlotte Lomas.
Is antimicrobial resistance the next pandemic?
We've been facing this problem of antimicrobial resistance for some time. It is spreading, it is affecting every country on the planet. So in that sense, it is already a pandemic. And perhaps people are very aware now of the impacts of the COVID pandemic, but they may not be so aware that the antimicrobial resistance that we face is equally, if not more important in terms of its long-term impacts on the planet, on our human health. It's already estimated that 700,000 people a year die from drug-resistant infections. In other words, infections that normally could be treated, but because of antimicrobial resistance, those have become untreatable or were not able to be treated with what was available. And it's a situation that is expected in many ways to really worsen over the next decades. And if left unaddressed, we expect it could cause around 10 million deaths a year by 2050.
What exactly drives antimicrobial resistance?
Essentially, we are the reason that antimicrobial resistance is growing. It's the way that we use these precious chemicals, these precious molecules to treat infections. We've become accustomed to using antibiotics to deal with our health problems. We use them in people to treat infections. We also use them in animals, and they're used also in other agricultural sectors to some extent. We live in one planet. We have really what we consider is common resources of water, which are used between people and animals. And in our environment, the exchange of drug-resistant microbes is taking place, and that's because those microbes have developed resistance because of the behaviors we have with the way we use antimicrobials. So in the end, it's a problem that affects all of us, but it comes in the end from our own behaviors.
And how do we tackle this problem? Are there any lessons that can be learnt from our response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
The problems of changing our culture are quite significant. How do we really get past this behavior that when disease strikes, we think of using antimicrobials? At the same time, preventing those infections in the first place would be even better. If we didn't have those infections to start with, we wouldn't need the antimicrobials. So it is important to really reduce the risk of disease for animals, for people, and that will actually reduce the antimicrobial use. Now, convincing enough people around the world that we need to change our behaviors, that's not a small thing. So we've seen in the pandemic how practices can help to reduce the risk of becoming ill. The way that we wash our hands, the way that we use masks, the way that we would keep distance. We've learnt a number of things. Now we also have to apply those lessons that behavior change, it is possible. It sometimes can be done really quite quickly. So I think we've got some things that we can apply to this more silent pandemic of antimicrobial resistance. So all of us have an opportunity to make a difference. All of us can participate in controlling antimicrobial resistance.
What can countries do to tackle this global problem, and how is FAO supporting them?
Changing the way that we utilize antimicrobials at a large scale and at an individual scale is important to control. FAO has been working now for more than 5 years to help countries to put into place their national action plans for control of antimicrobial resistance. Currently working in over 40 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. At country level, we need to see a combined effort of sectors: medical, veterinary, agricultural, and from the side of policy, legislation, and the environment. That sounds difficult, but through One Health platforms for antimicrobial resistance, that's a device, a tool that's used by countries to bring those sectors together, because really this is a problem for all of us. We all have a role to play. We need others to play their roles as well. We have to work together, and together we're already seeing that that will make a difference at national level and bring us back on track to control antimicrobial resistance.
Oh, hi. Didn't see you there. Ever put gas in your car? Yeah, man, it's not that fun. And it costs money. If only there was a way that you could travel while using self-sustained energy and save money while doing it. Well, gee whiz, kids, do I have some news for you. Bicycles really do exist. They work so well. You just pedal and move to your destination. Feel fat? Spending too much money? Or just guilty about killing the earth? Bicycles. Free rides for years.
A PSA there on the benefits of cycling. Before that, a report from Charlotte Lomas of the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization on the threats posed by antimicrobial resistance. And opening the show, a selection of global news headlines from the past number of days. As this is our first episode, I should let you, our listener, know what to expect, but I'm also very much a believer in show don't tell, so perhaps those opening headlines give a sense of the types of issues of interest to me and which I plan to share with you each month. I'm a media studies researcher focused on grassroots, alternative and community media that enables social change. And so we'll be talking to people, listening to reports and sharing news stories that touch on social and political activism and the tools that enable it. We will hear stories from around the world about labour union activism, about journalism and media, and about international relations. And on each show we'll have reports from our special correspondents Tadhg and Noah, who you'll hear later in this show. But first, our main item today is an in-depth interview with Bob Naiman of Just Foreign Policy, a US-based organisation that seeks to push US foreign policy broadly to the left. When I spoke with Bob on Friday, 20th of November, Joe Biden had not yet announced his cabinet picks. Some have been named since we recorded this, and Donald Trump continued his obstructionism towards the Biden transition efforts. We opened our conversation by talking about Trump's moves to reduce troop levels in Afghanistan and Iraq, which some have characterized as an attempt to cause trouble for Biden, but which is also in line with long-standing demands of the anti-war movements in the US and worldwide.
So I would say, first of all, that all these things can be true at the same time. Exactly as you said, it can be true that Trump is setting fires, and that some of the fires that he's setting are quote unquote fires or obstacles that he's putting in Biden's path are things that, as you say, the anti-war left has been campaigning for some time, like getting out of Afghanistan. And it can also be true that Trump's way of doing it isn't, what we would like in an ideal world, but that we still like the direction, even if he's doing it in a Trumpy kind of way. And I would definitely put the Afghanistan withdrawal in this category. On the other hand, so something in the other category is he's ramping up sanctions on Iran. So that's a similar dynamic in the opposite direction. He's trying to make it harder for Biden to reestablish the diplomatic agreement with Iran that Trump walked out of with a lot of Democratic enablers. And Biden is coming in with the commitment to try to restore the Iran deal, but it's not going to be trivial because of all of the obstacles that have been put in the way in the last 4 years in terms of escalated sanctions on Iran, and also the ill will created by U.S. withdrawal from the agreement, and the sanctions that Trump is putting on now, and the assassination of the top Iranian government officials, so on and so forth. We're not starting from where we left off at the end of the Obama administration. We're starting much further back. And so Trump is trying to put more obstacles there. So it's also true that the dynamic of the experience that we're facing now is not unique to the lame duck period at the end of Trump's presidency. Some version of this always happens. On the one hand, there's a claim like, oh, the president shouldn't do anything after the election. That's what the opposition party says. Say, oh my God, Trump is putting obstacles, blah, blah, blah. But, when Trump won, Obama did things, some of which we liked. So, for example, Obama was very disappointing overall on the Israel-Palestine issue. Once Trump was elected, he did this 11th hour thing of allowing the UN, the resolution at the Security Council going through against Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And it was a sharp resolution that was supported by the Europeans, but the US abstained, which was unusual. Usually the US would veto. The past practice was the US Democratic Republic that veto any sharp resolution critical of Israel. The Obama administration let this one go through, and that was understood at the time was the Obama administration saw which direction Trump was moving on Israel-Palestine and was putting up a roadblock. So people who in the U.S. who support Palestinian rights like that 11th hour move. We'd love to see more stuff like that earlier, but we're better than nothing at the 11th hour. On Yemen, we had a similar dynamic that, we had been pushing the Obama administration to try to end the Saudi war in Yemen. And they had made a few small moves, like stopping the transfer of cluster bombs, which they did in the summer of 2016. At the 11th hour, they stopped the transfer of so-called PGMs, precision-guided missiles, to Saudi Arabia, which, the story for these weapons is, they're precision-guided, so don't worry, civilians aren't going to get hurt. In practice, the Saudis were using them to hit civilian targets. They had a list of civilian targets from the United States. Supposedly, they're supposed to be using the list not to hit civilian targets. Instead, they're using the list to hit the civilian targets with the precision-guided U.S. missiles. So finally, at the end of the Obama administration, they stop transferring these weapons to Saudi Arabia. Then Trump gets in and he puts them back. So these dynamics are not unique to this moment. Something like this always happens. It's so often been the case with Trump. You look at these dynamics, you can always point to precedents in the past, but Trump turns them up to 11.
Yeah.
So it's more heavy-handed, it's more extreme, as we're seeing now with the refusal to concede and the refusal to give authority for the transition process to happen. So the Trump administration officials are not being allowed to meet with Biden officials to talk about things like how are the getting out the vaccines, how's that going to work? So that's heavy-handed compared to the past, but very heavy-handed, and everything that they're doing to try and disrupt, the pulling out the stops. That's heavy-handed compared to the past. But some dynamic of sabotage of the incoming administration, attempts at sabotage of the incoming administration, that's not unique to our moment. So putting that to the side, going back to looking at a policy, what he's doing in Afghanistan is going to improve the position of people who want to end the war, Democrats and Republicans who want to end the war, by moving the status quo that Biden is going to face coming in. Biden has signaled that he wants to end the war. But of course, we were told this was the policy 6 to 8 years ago. And people have been circulating this online. In 2012, Obama said this war is going to end in 2014. In 2012, Biden, who was Obama's vice president and who was agitating, this is true, Biden was agitating inside the Obama administration to try to end the war. And he was the kind of the point person inside the Obama administration of the camp that was trying to end the war. Biden put out in 2012, this is ending in 2014. And here we are in 2020, and this is happening. So, here we are in 2020, and these troops are still there. And the people who, the quote unquote Democrats, people who present as Democrats, trying to keep the status quo, like, oh my God, Trump is withdrawing the troops. This is a drawdown of 2,000 troops. There's 4,500 now. They are going to draw down to 2,500 by the time Biden comes in. This is the alleged catastrophe. But what it means is that when Biden comes in, we're going to be in a better position relative to the people that want to maintain the status quo. Because if they want Biden to have 4,500 troops, then he's going to have to add those troops. And he's going to have to tell people why he's doing that and justify it. Lots of people are not going to want that. So it changes the baseline for what we're going to be dealing with on January 21st. It makes it harder for Biden to continue the war. It makes it easier for Biden to end the war. And it makes it easier for people who want to end the war by moving the baseline.
Okay, and I think that's useful perspective. And as you say, the fact that Trump may be turning this up to 11, but I suppose we can take advantage of what he sees perhaps as being fire setting. As you say, it has advantages in shifting status quo. Apart from Afghanistan, you mentioned there, of course, situation with Iran, and as I know you've said to me previously, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Israel, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, all intertwined in terms of how they're thought about in U.S. Foreign policy. They're kind of all part of a piece that revolves often around issues in or relationships around the power centers of Israel and of Saudi Arabia. Outside of the troop issue itself, you mentioned the status quo around Iran is less favorable than it was a number of years ago. What do you see as the kind of the moving parts, the areas that people should be paying attention to in terms of foreign policy around in terms of these issues over the next, should we say, 6 months or so, as lay people looking at what's happening?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to observe. You remember and observe. The United States is a global power, right? Which is engaged in conflicts and struggles all over the world. So within the elites of both parties in Washington, of people that are focused on foreign policy, it's often the case that there are fights over focus. We should be doing more over here and less over here, given that resources are finite. So that makes it complicated to say, somebody say, we have these arguments about, like, someone will try and claim that Trump is an anti-war president, or, that the Republicans are worse than Democrats or better than Democrats. And because there are all these different issues, it's often the case that Republicans are better on some things and worse on other things, and the converse. And so you simply can't understand the reality in a helpful way by just trying to have one indicator of, like, better and worse. You have to look at different things. And while it's true that there are clusters, so Trump was very skeptical on the war in Afghanistan and wanted to get out. He was skeptical on the involvement in Syria and wanted to get out. But he was not at all skeptical on the relationship with Saudi Arabia and the war in Yemen. Quite the contrary, he doubled down. So it's important to understand these different chunks. One way of thinking about it is to think that there's a chunk that revolves, as you said. Let's say there's a triangle consisting of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran. And then there's a chunk of conflicts that are associated with that triangle, like the war in Yemen, the war in Syria, the question of the Iran nuclear deal, which is kind of, important in of itself, but also symbolic of the overall relationship. Okay, so if you think of the relationship, where is the U.S. in this triangle? Historically, the U.S. is almost on the line segment that connects Saudi Arabia to Israel. And you can think of Obama's push for the Iran nuclear deal as an attempt to move the U.S. a little bit away from the line segment that connects the U.S., that connects Saudi Arabia to Israel. And the opposition, the militant, bitter opposition to the Iran deal was not so much how many centrifuges are spinning in Iran. It was that there are interests that are very invested in trying to keep the U.S. as close as possible to the line segment that connects Saudi Arabia and Israel. In fact, their ideal world is that the U.S. is exactly on the line segment. So, that's why, even if you don't care that much how many centrifuges Iranians are spinning, you're for peace in the Middle East and less conflict. We all had a big stake in the Iran nuclear deal because the point was to try and move the U.S. away from that line segment. And the hope of many of us who supported that was we didn't just want to have a deal over Iran's nuclear program. We want the U.S. to be much more towards the center of the triangle and get away from this idea that it's the job of the U.S. and the U.S. military to enforce Saudi and Israeli aspirations for hegemony in the Middle East. Like, we want to reduce conflicts and tensions and stop wars, and we want Saudi Arabia and Israel to accept the fact that Iran is there, and regime change in Iran is not the job of the United States, and the Israelis and the Saudis have to accept the fact that Iran is there and make accommodation. And that's not hard. That's not inconceivable. You can see in the past where it happened. For example, in Lebanon, after 2006, the Israeli government had a long-term goal of trying to impose an Israeli-friendly government in Lebanon, or let's say a Saudi-Israeli government in Lebanon. So Israel and Saudi Arabia had this goal. They failed at this goal, and eventually, they fought a series of wars, did lots of things to achieve this goal. Finally, after lots of unnecessary bloodshed, they withdrew from Lebanon, accepted an accommodation where Hezbollah was influential in the Lebanese government. It wasn't the Lebanese government, it was influential in the Lebanese government. There was a peace deal, and everybody accommodated. And the Europeans had a relationship not with Hezbollah, but they had a relationship with the Lebanese government, which everybody knew related to Hezbollah, and so did the U.S. And people accepted that. Okay, now we have peace in Lebanon. There's the deal, and that was from the point of view of civilians in Lebanon, as messy as that deal was, it was an advance because they had peace and a normal economy, and you could have your business and live your life and go to school and not be blown up. That's a big advance for human beings. So that shows that kind of accommodation is possible. In Iraq, there was a similar accommodation between the U.S. and Iran in Iraq, a messy accommodation with conflict, but where the U.S. and Iran accepted they had a common interest in, a government in Iran, a Shiite majority government in Iran. They would deal with the Al-Qaeda problem and govern the country. So these kinds of accommodations are possible, which are overwhelmingly in the interest of the majority of civilian human beings who live in these countries, who need peace and a normal life where they can live like normal human beings and have businesses and jobs, go to school and get married, have children, and not get blown up, and live in their house without their house being destroyed and becoming refugees. So that is, that's a modest goal, which we should all share. And there's a group of people who don't want that, who are constantly trying to push the U.S. government in the direction of regime change and wars for regime change to overthrow governments that the Saudis and the Israelis don't like. And that's the world we've been living with for the last 20 years in U.S. policy in the region under presidents of both parties, with rare moments where we've been able to defeat the adversary forces. And one of them was the Iran nuclear deal, where at least we were able to defeat them for a while. Then they came in and reversed it, but we still didn't have a war with Iran. So there's still something to defend and protect and try to win there, which is trying to get the Iran deal back, improve relationships with Iran, get back towards the center of the triangle, end the Yemen war, try to end the war in Syria. There's big wins that we can get. We can't undo all the horrible things that happened in the past, but we could get big wins in the coming year or two on ending these wars and making life a lot better for the civilian population of these countries and reducing the commitments, military commitments of the United States, and forcing the Saudi and Israeli governments to accept that it's not the job of the United States to, be their army for enforcing these ambitions. And that's what's at stake now. And we're at a juncture. We're at a small but significant fork in the road on this path in these days, because next week or so, sometime around Thanksgiving, the Biden transition team is going to start rolling out its appointments for the National Security Cabinet. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of the CIA. For sure, they're around Thanksgiving, they're going to roll out what's probably the next one, the Secretary of the Treasury. Shortly after that, they will roll out these three key national security picks: Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary and Director of the CIA. In all the three cases, they've kind of hung out in the media the short list, which is kind of a Goldilocks list of, somebody that, it's like around 3 or 4 choices. There's somebody that would be kind of exciting to progressives, somebody who would be horrifying to progressives, somebody who's kind of in the middle. And so our task, which is, those of us who care about these things and see the escalation path, looking back at the Obama administration, seeing the escalation path that goes from here, or the path towards peace and diplomacy that goes from here. Our task is to the extent we can, avoid the terrible choice, push for the better choice, and if we can wind up in the middle choice, not the terrible choice, we call that a partial victory. And that's what I'm focused on right now for state, defense, and CIA. Our best outcome at the State Department is to get Senator Chris Murphy, Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, who led efforts to end the Saudi war in Yemen, who has been 100% supporter of U.S. diplomacy with Iran and the Iran nuclear deal, and who has also been a leader on trying to stop the Israeli annexation of the West Bank. So that's our probably A+ outcome, Chris Murphy. Our A- outcome is William Burns, who was Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration, whose career foreign service, who's been a strong supporter of diplomacy with Iran, who would, rebuild morale at the State Department and, bring back diplomacy as a focus of U.S. foreign policy, not everything military force a threat for it. And our worst outcome is Delaware Senator Chris Coons, who's basically running as a candidate of AIPAC, of the Israel lobby, who voted for the Obama's Iran deal, but then immediately started working with AIPAC to undermine it. So this is the juncture that we face at the State Department. On defense, our best outcomes are, or least bad outcomes are, Tammy Duckworth, Illinois senator, decorated combat veteran, who's been in the broad mainstream of Senate Democrats, and she's on the Armed Services Committee, or Jay Johnson, who was Homeland Security Director in the Obama administration, Pentagon General Counsel. Our worst outcome, and here she's been cited on press reports as the favorites. This is where our hand is weakest, I think, is Michelle Flournoy, who was in the Defense Department in the Obama administration, who led on the escalation in Afghanistan, who, when she was out of government, was a champion of the Saudi war in Yemen, Saudi arms deals, who was an advocate of military escalation in Syria. So she represents, the forces like Chris Coons are trying to get us back onto the Saudi-Israel line segment. So that's who we're trying to block, Michelle Flournoy, and our best chances are Tammy Duckworth or Jay Johnson. It's CIA. Our best hope is an Obama person, is a Obama-Biden person, the Biden person, Tom Donilon, who's been a key, a close Biden observer, a close Biden advisor for years. And our worst outcome is Mike Morrell, who is a CIA guy, who is out of government, who's a very aggressive champion of military force against Iran. So that's the juncture that we face right now in Biden's restaurant. And an analogy that I have been using to try and get people to see what the stakes of this are is if we look at Obama's appointments for Secretary of State, he came in January 2009 and appointed Hillary Clinton as his first Secretary of State, the very person who we had just defeated in the 2008 primary in order, from the point of view of many of us, to try and keep her away from U.S. policy in the Middle East. She voted for the Iraq War. She's very close to the pro-war people in the Democratic Party, particularly the anti-Iran people. She called for obliterating Iran during the primary. She ran as a hawk. So we won, yay. And then the first thing we get is Hillary as Secretary of State. But in January 2013, when Hillary left the Obama administration, then we got John Kerry as Secretary of State. Now, he also wasn't, our visionary dream. He also voted for the Iraq War. But he was much more seen as a pro-diplomacy person. And in fact, as Secretary of State, he led the negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal. So we got the Iran nuclear deal when John Kerry was Secretary of State, not when Hillary was Secretary of State. So that proves, and after all, now who's going to be president? Joe Biden, who was Obama's Secretary of State. So it must be the case that even in Biden's restaurant, and we all know we're not in Alice's restaurant where you can get everything you want. We're in Biden's restaurant where you can't get everything you want. But even in Biden's restaurant, it should be possible to have someone more like John Kerry, who is a diplomacy person, than someone like Hillary, who was, even as Secretary of State, much more of a military escalation person, supported the military escalation in Afghanistan, was the top cheerleader of the war in Libya as Secretary of State. Probably the main reason that the war in Libya happened was that Hillary championed as Secretary of State, even when Obama was against it. She led the charge of people like Susan Rice and Samantha Power, who championed that inside the Obama administration. So the stakes of these, what might seem like small differences from, viewed from far away, they're actually quite high. We're going to have, either Chris Murphy or William Burns or Chris Coons as Secretary of State, probably for the next 4 years. We're going to have Tammy Duckworth or Jay Johnson or Michelle Flournoy as Secretary of Defense for the next 4 years. We're going to have Tom Donilon or Avril Haines or Mike Morrell as CIA director for the next 4 years. That could make a difference between having something like the Libya war and not having it. That could make a difference between getting back to the Iran nuclear deal and not doing it. That could make a difference between ending the Yemen war now versus ending it after lots more, years from now, after lots of more unnecessary bloodshed. So the stakes of these choices are potentially quite high.
Well, that's a really, I think one of the things that's a challenge for people perhaps in Ireland in particular, because we've so many party groupings, the ideological spectrum in any single party is much narrower than I think it is inside either the Democrats or the Republicans. And so that notion, as you say, sure, they're inside the same party, they're inside the same party apparatus, but the difference between Chris Murphy and a Chris Coons is quite significant in terms of their approach towards issues of war and peace and foreign policy.
Yes, although I would say I'm going out on a limb here because my knowledge of Irish politics is weak, but one way of understanding it is, for a long time, power rotated in Ireland between two broad parties, right? Fine Gael and Foyle. And those parties were more ideological diverse, as opposed to the Irish Labour Party, which is much more of an agenda, right? So, but yes, exactly as you say, in the United States we have these two, very broad coalitions that compete, and then within each party you have very different camps. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's somebody associated with the more left or more progressive side of the Democratic Party, said, and who's maybe known to some progressives in Ireland because that's how high her profile is. She said some months ago that in Europe, Joe Biden and I would be in different political parties, and that's true. So it is exactly as you say that there are these fights where it not only hard for people in Europe to follow, but hard for people in the United States to follow, because everybody fighting is wearing the same color jersey. They're all quote unquote Democrats, but they're fighting for very different things. Some of them are fighting for ending wars and for peace and diplomacy, and other people are fighting for more wars and extending wars. And this is only true on foreign policy, of course. This is also true on domestic. Some people want to see very big stimulus, big economic stimulus. Some people want to see aggressive moves towards real universal healthcare, like we were promised in the Obama administration, and universal college, which used to be much more normal in the United States, and now has become very much of a two-tier thing. So we have these fights over and over, issue by issue, and the jerseys don't tell you that much. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, for example, is the leader of House Democrats. She's on the other side of all these issues from the progressives. She's really a leader of the right wing of the Democratic Party in the United States. So it does make it hard to follow, but harder to follow. But that's what we have to deal with. I mean, it's very much more the case than in Europe that you have to look at names of politicians if you're trying to understand it. Although again, I would say it's not 1-0. You look at the Labour Party in Britain, the group of people around Jeremy Corbyn. There is a group of people. They have an organization whose name is escaping my mind right now.
Momentum, you think?
What's that?
You may be thinking of Momentum, are you?
Exactly. So clearly there's a group of people in the Labour Party, British Labour Party, who were very pro-Corbyn, and Corbyn's gone. I mean, not dead, but he's gone. But those people are still there, and they're still supporting people in the British Labour Party who want those kinds of policies and that kind of leadership. And we have similar dynamics in the United States. Like, we had Bernie. Okay, so Bernie didn't make it, but Bernie's still there, and there's still a group of people who are pushing for those kinds of policies. And they're not all exactly the same, but they're broadly similar. There's Bernie Sanders, there's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, there's Jamal Bowman in New York City. There's a group called Justice Democrats which helped a lot of these people get elected in the House, AOC and Jamal Bowman and so on. So there's a small, weak, still very weak infrastructure. I mean, Nancy Pelosi just got reelected just this past week, in the last couple of days, as leader of House Democrats, without even any formal opposition, unopposed, even though Democrats just lost seats in the election that just happened. You'd think there might be some kind of token opposition. No, like even the Syrians and the Russians allow token opposition. Zion, who is a liberal writer in the American Prospect, just looking at the domestic issues, refers to the House under Nancy Pelosi as North Korea. That's how Stalinist the situation is with the House Democrats. So in some ways, we're very weak and far back, even on domestic economic policy issues, in having a block of people that people could look from the outside, even the United States, and say, oh, that block is fighting for these policies. Every once in a while, we manage to get something to the level where there's a fight that people can see. Yemen is an example of that. We got using the War Powers Resolution, which allows any member of Congress to force a vote on war that Congress never authorized. We were able to create a fight that the leadership of the Democratic Party didn't want. With Chris Murphy using the Army Support Control Act, which has a similar mechanism, with Ro Khanna in the House, and then with Bernie Sanders, Mike Lee, and Chris Murphy in the Senate, we're able to create a fight where Democratic leadership didn't want any fight. And eventually, although we haven't ended the war in Yemen yet, we were able to turn around the whole Democratic Party. So that's normal now. That's the normal position of Democrats in the United States now, is end the Yemen war and stop the arms transfers to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And this is a fight that's happening right now. If you look around at stuff people are writing in the United States now about what we want to see happen in the Biden administration, the top of many people's list is end the Yemen war, stop the arms transfers to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That's a legacy of the fights that we started even in the Obama administration and in the Trump administration that put this at the top of Democrats' agenda.
Wonderful. Well, you mentioned there early on, or earlier, when, as you were talking about how people can, track these things. You said, watch for names, watch for groups of names. And I think earlier, it's useful for those of us perhaps watching from Ireland and from abroad. You did provide some of those names that, as we watched that national security cabinet, as I think you put it, come into shape. We'll get a sense of just which groups are ending up at the table, what the mix is there in terms of state, defense, and, as you said, CIA as the third leg of that stool. So thank you so much, Bob, for that, and for the insight into the state of play in the US and in the US foreign policy struggles, I suppose, at this point in time.
You're welcome.
And with thanks there to Bob Naiman for his input and his generosity with his time in sharing with us some of his insights and his thoughts on the Biden transition and on the likely directions for US foreign policy over the next number of years. I should disclose to listeners, of course, that Bob was a co-presenter on a previous version of this show we ran about a decade ago on WRFU in Urbana, Illinois. for a number of years, along with a number of other stations in the US. So glad to be back on the airwaves here on Flirt FM, where I started out as a reporter. To close out the show now, we're going to have some special guests, and as I noted earlier in the show, special correspondents who will be with us for each episode at the end of each month. And they are Tadhg and Noah, and they'll be bringing their insights as younger members of our community and of my family. So let's hear from Noah. Okay, we're with Noah. And Noah, you're learning about numbers in school and about adding, right?
Yeah.
And you're practicing that using blocks?
Yeah.
Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Yes. 1 plus it equals 7. 7 plus 7 make 40. 40 and 4 make 18.
Ah, very good. And you are using blocks to do that. So that's a good way to, if someone's listening who's learning about numbers and about adding, do you think it's a helpful way to learn?
Yes.
Why do you like learning using blocks?
Because I can count the blocks. Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16.
Can you tell me something?
Yes.
Is learning about numbers your favorite thing to do in senior infants?
1.
It's one of your favorite things.
No, senior infant 1.
Oh, you're in senior infants 1. Noah, is learning about numbers your favorite thing to do in senior infants 1?
My favorite is eating.
You like eating, you like lunchtime.
Yes. Because food. We bring our own food to class. And do you hear that crackling? That is my very own 18 block.
Very good. Do you like learning? Is there something else you like learning about in senior infants?
No.
Nope. Just numbers.
No. There are 2 things. Adding, subtracting, and eating. Lunchtime.
Thanks to Noah for sharing some of what he's learning in senior infants this year. A little change of pace now as we look at the Science and Engineering Festival that happened not on the NUIG campus this year, the annual NUI Galway Festival in virtual form this year. And so we've a report from one of the people who got to watch some of the online activities for that. Okay, Tadhg, you watched the live show that was part of the Galway Science Festival. That was different from the way it's been for science festivals the last few years. Well, how was it different?
Because for the last few years it's been in NUIG, but this year, because of COVID-19, it has to be online.
Mm-hmm. And so some of the things that they had for the festival were recorded in advance, and people could watch them over the weekend. Other things happened live, and you got to be one of the 500 people who got to watch the live show that happened this morning. Who was presenting that? It was you knew the presenter. You recognized the presenter, I think.
Yeah, I recognized one of the 2 presenters, Moonshore John from Homeschool Hub, and Clara, who I do not know, but I think I recognize her now because she was in RTE Junior. Plus, you might recognize me from Flirt FM's annual birthday.
Yeah, that's the last time you were on the radio. Now, what sort of things did they have on because it was different, it was online, it wasn't like when it's in the university, when it's live shows that you travel around the university to see. What was it like watching it on the computer or the phone instead?
Kind of the same, just we had to watch the thing in a strict order because it was live. We couldn't skip ahead to another part then skip back.
Yeah, and usually when we're at the live show, we get to choose what to go to next and then come back and go around. Now, what sort of shows did they have? They had some of the same shows or little small versions of some of the shows that they often have at the Science Festival.
They have the usual shows because it was more than an hour or 2 hours long.
Okay. And so for some of the people listening will have been to the Science Festival before. Some of them may not have been. So can you give an example of some of the things that you saw in this year's show?
I saw the bug doctor, scientific zoo.
There was a science of juggling as well, wasn't
there?
The
science of the circus.
Okay, very good. And which was your favourite?
I think it has to be the bug doctor.
Always a crowd favourite. Why do you like the bug doctor?
Well, 'cause he's a doctor for bugs. It's kind of in his name.
It is self-explanatory. What sort of bugs did he have this year?
Well, not all bugs. He had a snake in there too. He had a snake, something that looked a bit like a Komodo dragon. He had a lizard, he had a scorpion, and he had a tarantula.
All the big name favourites, I think, from his shows. That sounds exciting. Next year, hopefully, it'll be the end. COVID-19 will be finished. We'll be back to normal. Do you think they should keep any of it online, or do you think they should go back to having it in person?
I think they should keep some of it online and back in person. Just online, they record it before they put it out, so you can skip ahead and back and stuff like that. They should have all of it online and live in NUIG.
Okay, well, Tadhg, thank you so much for doing that review of this year's Science Festival for our listeners.
You're welcome. This had been a critical ear.
A Critical Ear is broadcast on Flirt FM in Galway and available online at acriticalear.info. Presented and produced by Andrew O'Boyle. Guest appearances by Bob Naiman of Just Foreign Policy, Tadhg and Noah. Thank you to UN News Audio for use of their clip.